Banking. It's something that many people take for granted, especially in our modern age. It's so easy to just tap your card or phone and be on your way. But have you ever stopped and thought about a world before modern banking? A world which was far more difficult and far more dangerous than the world that we live in today? A world in which the rich had to build walls and castles to protect their wealth, and one in which just taking a journey through the countryside for the average person could end in disaster. Take a moment to picture what life was like back then, at a time before smartphones, credit cards, and even YouTube. A time before even electricity, modern medicine, and steam engines. Aside from all the old-timey diseases and possibility of imminent invasion from your closest neighbour, it's easy to think that life was much simpler back then. And look, maybe you're right. There was nothing like payday loans, asset financing, or mortgage repayments to contend with. And in order to communicate with people, the only option was to see them face to face or to write a letter. But let's hang on a second. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. If we wind the clock back, for most of human history, people lived a life in a relatively small geographic area, doing things like growing crops or raising animals, and later on, as civilization began to grow, things like becoming a soldier or a guard or a travelling merchant. And naturally, with the increase in trade came the introduction of things such as metal coins. It was no longer practical to be like Job from the Bible and carry around an army of 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. As you can imagine, if you were one of the lucky few who was able to get their hands on some of these newfangled coins, the last thing you'd want to do is keep them under the floorboards or behind the garden shed where any old Tom, Dick or Harry could come along and pilfer them. As a result, people started to do things like storing them in temples, where naturally there were people around who were considered trustworthy enough to guard them. Interestingly, these early Mesopotamian priests would often lend the resources out to local farmers and merchants, and in doing so keep a record of their transactions, which was the beginning of what we now call bookkeeping. This system worked great at a time with limited technology, and was later built upon by the Greeks and then the Romans to include things such as money lending, followed by bills of exchange, which at the time could be used throughout the entire empire. Unfortunately for the history of banking, however, the Roman Empire came to an abrupt end, and with it, so did the majority of finance activities. Now you may be wondering, how do we go from a largely medieval society to today? A time in which we have smartphones, aeroplanes, the internet, and a really complex economy, built on, well, effectively nothing? Well, the answer is this: slowly. A form of banking re-emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries with the Knights Templar, at a time when pilgrims needed to store valuables and transfer funds for their pilgrimage to the Holy Land, but this was only a shadow of what we have today. It's so easy to take our current financial system for granted. Never before in history has a society been so wealthy and had access to so much opportunity that we often forget to remember that it took hundreds of years to get to such a point. Going from a time of mostly growing your own food to being able to put your credit card details in online and have it delivered to your front door the very next day, it's not easy. But the real banking breakthroughs came in Renaissance Europe. Now, before we go there, let's take a quick detour. The essence of banking is fairly simple and is often overlooked. Effectively, you have some wealth which you want to keep safe and you give it to a bank to guard. In the early days, it was cheaper and safer to give it to a bank than it was to keep it on your person or in your house. With enough depositors, an early bank was able to invest far more in security than an average person. On top of that, they also ended up with quite a large vault of gold and other coins. As a result, instead of them just sitting there and collecting dust, it made sense to lend them out to other people in the community who had various business ideas and in return charge interest. As a result, the value of your bank account would grow over time, and of course the bank themselves would take a portion of it, but that was far better than having that wealth sitting under the floorboards at home. But it was the ability to borrow and lend money which really began to change things. Now, back to Renaissance Europe. In 15th century Florence, a very prominent banking family emerged, known as the Medici family. Although they came out of Florence, they grew to have branches all over Europe, including as far away as London and even Barcelona. We can credit the Medici family with a few inventions, including what's known as double entry bookkeeping, which interestingly enough is still the method which we use in accounting today, along with what is known as letters of credit, which are a precursor to checks, if anyone here is old enough to remember what one of these actually looks like. As you can imagine, at this time, moving money around Europe wasn't the safest thing to do, and so having the bank issue letters of credit meant you didn't have to carry around large amounts of coins. It also gave someone else assurance that they would be paid as the money was already held in the bank. Things were slightly different back then when it came to interest, as the Catholic Church had largely declared that charging interest was a sin. And as a result, the banks had some different methods of being paid for their lending. For example, capitalising on exchange rates or receiving discounted prices from their borrowers. The Medici banking empire was built upon their reputation, and although it eventually collapsed, largely due to its overexpansion and the lack of family interest, this principle still holds true within the financial systems of today. Ultimately, for a system to work, it has to be built on trust. The Medicis made some massive inroads into the world of banking, and following on from them, the birth of modern banking is largely attributed to the founding of the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609, which is often credited with being the world's first central bank, or at least a variant of it. Remarkably, the idea was almost stumbled upon by accident. At the time, the Dutch were at the centre of worldwide trade as a result of the Dutch East India Company, and naturally that meant a huge number of different foreign currencies flooding into the Netherlands. To combat various economic problems, the central bank accepted the deposits of many different coins and converted them into what was known as bank money, a singular currency held in an account which effectively wasn't backed by any single physical currency, almost a precursor to today's fiat currency. Although it was still possible to make withdrawals at the time in various currencies, many people avoided this as it was cheaper to trade with their bank money. The result of this shouldn't be understated. Before the Bank of Amsterdam, money was always a tangible thing which you could hold in some way, shape or form, but afterwards it became something much more abstract, a balance in an account. From this point onwards, it was only natural that the world was about to change, both financially but also technologically. There has always been a symbiosis between the two. The financial system plays such a vital role in a society, and getting it right is the difference between individuals just simply having a vision and them actually being able to live it out in the world. In the following century, banking spread all over Europe and even as far as the New World, with the founding of the Bank of New York in 1784, with the new technology driving the speed at which money was able to be changing hands. In the 1800s, we had the telegraph, and then shortly afterwards the telephone, and as a result we saw the first wireless transfers, and it didn't stop there. Today we have ATMs, online banking, contactless payments and so much more, which at one point in time people wouldn't have even been able to comprehend. In fact, to someone who was alive during the Middle Ages, sending your money to a friend halfway across the world from your smartphone in an instant would have been absolutely unthinkable. And speaking of smartphones, would you even have one if it weren't for the world's financial and economic systems allowing for companies to raise capital on the world's financial markets, or to pay their suppliers on the other side of the world? And as for whether that's a good thing or not, I'll let you decide. But next time you tap your phone on the card reader to buy a coffee, maybe it's worth reflecting on the enormous amount of work that has gone into allowing you to do just that, and just how much the world has changed as a result of banking. And that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching. I've been the Time Travelling Tour Guide, and I look forward to seeing you next time.